This is the Social Change Agency podcast.
Hi, and welcome to the Social Change Agency podcast. I'm Esther, the CEO. Today, I'm delighted to be chatting with Uma Mishra-Newbery, Executive Director of Women's March Global. We're sitting down ahead of our Losing Control in Funding and Commissioning event on the 4th of March this year. Losing Control is a network of people and organisations exploring how to practically distribute power. This event, as the name suggests, will focus specifically on funding and commissioning. It will be a day of honest conversations with funders, grantmakers and grantees, looking at how we should be innovating to better address the social challenges we face today. Uma's session is on funding movements and networks, not people and projects, so I'm catching up with her today to talk through some of the challenges inherent in the sector and the opportunities that lie in changing the traditional approach. Morning, Uma.
Good morning, Esther. How are you?
I am feeling much better now. This horrendous storm that we've had for 3 days has swept through and we've got blue skies and sunshine, so I feel like a bit of normal. What's it been like where you are?
It's been grey because we're in the Valley of Geneva, but it's been, it's a kind of bluish sky today, so I'm feeling your upbeatness in that.
Yeah. It's amazing how much your mood and everything changes if the sun is shining.
Absolutely.
And not related to that is also how the sun shines a lot. You feel when you get funding for your work.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today, because our whole Losing Control and Funding Commissioning event is actually looking at how the changing nature of funding social change. Because the social change, the way we've approached it, has changed in the past 20 years. And it's only natural that the funding structures that go into it are changing too. Mm-hmm. Now, you've been Executive Director at Women's March Global for a considerable time. Mm-hmm. What's your experience of been about sort of getting funded?
The funding space has been an immense challenge, and getting funding has been an even greater struggle. This was a social movement, Women's March Global, that was born out of the response to the election of Donald Trump in the United States. And so we are a very young organization, and young organizations are very high risk for foundations. So when we're talking about obtaining funding in the funding space, and you're talking to foundations, whether they be large or small, they're always looking at, what is the risk that we're going to incur, by giving you a grant. And the political nature of movements is high risk, yet funders want to remain as low risk as possible, which is just not helpful. If we're trying to really achieve gender equality and gender equity and social justice. These are all high-risk scenarios, and yet the funding world seems to be stuck in this idea that, they want to somehow push the envelope forward in societal progress and social justice and change, and yet they don't want to be high-risk in this with us. So it's a continuation of a very white supremacist way of working, because it's a failure to recognize that the people that are on the front lines of social justice movements are the ones that are the most marginalized, are the ones that are continually, daily facing, microaggressions and white supremacy. And yet in the funding world, right, and we have to take those big risks on the front lines of the social justice movement. We are very aware of the risks that we take. We are very aware of doing a huge amount with very little. And yet in the funding world, they failed to jump into that massive space of uncomfortability, into that space of, needing to just understand that this is a high risk space and fund that. So it's a massive inequity.
What do you think a funder would say if they were sitting here? Do you think they would reflect that back? Or do you think they'd have a different theory?
I think that they would try to pat themselves on the back for listening and understanding that, movements take a lot of work. But every funding conversation that I've been a part of, there is this recognition that what movements do is so important. And there's a recognition that, for example, what Women's March Global does is so important. But then on the flip side, 9 times out of 10, the response that we get as to why we're not getting funding is, well, we just need to see you all, wait for a year and see how you all grow, and just make sure that it's a solid organization. But how can it be a solid organization if we don't have the funds to make it a solid organization? I feel like funders are patting themselves on the back and saying that they're listening, but not actually really listening.
I mean, Uma, don't you have independent wealth that you could just bring into this? I mean, surely you can work for free for 3 years and then prove a point here.
My massive intergenerational wealth based out of, colonialism is really what's funding my...
Or maybe a rich man that could just prop you up,
100%.
Because that would help the Women's March Global, I think. I mean, we're laughing about it, but actually, we witness all the time that we have kind of groups that are doing incredible work that have that same kind of narrative repeated to them. Like, you go away and, sort of think, come back to us and you're a bit more resilient, a bit stronger. We'll see where we are. And actually, what we find is that often those that are doing the work are in that double loop of pushing the line, pushing across the line, changing a system, coming up against it, and doing it in a voluntary capacity, because they're burning out.
Yes.
So I'm seeing like the whole path, especially in the women's movement at the moment, sort of littered with broken women that are just exhausted. Do you share that frustration and observation? Or
100%. I've seen just within my own personal circle, 3 friends of mine who are executive directors, women of color, who have completely burned out because of the lack of the support that they either are not getting from their boards or not getting from the funding space, or just the toxicity of the work environments within the social justice space. And I myself have been a volunteer ED for the past now 7 months. And the only reason that I'm able to be a volunteer is because I have great unemployment benefits here in Switzerland. But that too is going to run out. So there are a lot of decisions that I need to make, in order to figure out, well, how do I continue moving this movement forward? Is this something that is able to be sustained, given that the funding space is so incredibly challenging? And, it's really frustrating. We spend so much of our time fighting and organizing for resources rather than fighting and organizing for the change that we need. And yet, it's this vicious feedback loop. We say this to the funders, we say this to the donors, that it would be amazing if we could be supported so that I don't have to spend 90% of my time chasing the money, but that we could actually be organizing in the way that we need to be organizing. And that isn't happening. I think, especially when we're talking about progressive funders, one of the things that we need to recognize is that, talking about foundations now, because foundations have failed to really focus on what equity looks like truly within the nonprofit space. Foundations have funded and put in grants, large grants, but these grants have not really honed in on a basic value proposition of what equity looks like. And if we were funding equity, we would then be saying that we need to have policies in place so that people who work in the movement space are protected, so that workers' rights within the nonprofit space are highly, valued. But how many times, Esther, have you heard about the support for workers' rights within the nonprofit space specifically?
I mean, there's a blog post that's going alongside the conference, so I'm actually writing just about that, and actually how administration and decision making should really be at the heart of everything before the funding comes in. So no, I absolutely agree with you. I think what I find really interesting is that I've worked in both the startup space and the sort of grassroots organising space. And it's really interesting how the big investors into tech and so on are happy. They kind of have a more tolerance of risk, a higher tolerance of risk, and will spread their investment portfolio, knowing that out of the sort of 10 that they put their investments in, 7 will fail and 3 will do really well. And actually just understand that and therefore recognise this is how you find the thing that makes the change, that makes the product, that makes the shift in services. And that kind of approach, I haven't seen that in the foundation world. I'm not saying that one is right or wrong, because that one's also based on sort of capitalist ideologies, and that's, got all the inherent issues that we were talking about. But I guess on just sort of the approach to risk seems healthier in a sense, because working with social change is really risky. And I would like to see funding structures that help everyone manage the risk properly and not at the expense of people.
Absolutely. What you have said is spot on. And I would just add to that I do think that the reason why the tech space is so good about supporting failures, right? It's from those failures that you can go through like 3 or 4 different product iterations and end up with a product that makes you the most money, right? But you have to bank on those failures in order to actually get to that thing that you're looking for. And the tech world has really supported that, right? But within the social justice space, what we are banking on is humans, right? We're banking on humans doing the work of social justice and social change. And humans are not predictable. They are high risk because we cannot predict 100% of the time what someone's behavior is going to be like, or how they're going to show up in these spaces, or how tired they're going to be, or what's going to happen on the front lines. It is a very high risk environment. And yet when we're talking about how the SDGs and how much advancement we've seen in gender equality. I mean, this is such a massive year for it because of Beijing 2020, right? So when we're talking about all of those things, the funding world still, for whatever reason, believes that this space does not come with all of those inherent risks. And I say this as a very blanket statement. I recognize that. However, we do not, when we're in, there's only been one funding conversation that I've ever been in my time as executive director, which has been a year and a half, let's say. So there's only been one funding conversation that I've been in where the funder has asked me, how are you doing? How's your team doing? Do you feel supported? Only one funder has actually gone through and asked us that, right? So I keep on going back to this idea of what if foundations actually focused on workers' rights within the nonprofit space, right? What if foundations actually focused on fiscal policy and organizational policy and supporting nonprofits and NGOs and social movements and building that, right? So fund us helping build those structures so that we can be supported in the movement forward. And it's going to fail. There's no perfect iteration of this that we've seen in any movement, right? But we're building on the learnings from every single movement that has come before us. So we're bound to get better, but you have to fund us in the failing of this so that we can move forward, right? Otherwise, we're just doing this all exhausted, running on fumes, burning out, crumbling, which is exactly what's happening.
I know, and if you add into the mix, part of the reason why you're high risk, I think, is because people that are in the space generally have exposure to the issues. They're personally motivated, and they've got the lived experience of the injustices that they're fighting against. So pushed to the edge when you're, like you say, running on empty and everything else, we tend to replicate the structures that we're fighting against, and we feel it way more. There's no kind of mediating infrastructure that can help us to manage that, and it's different. I think about your your question there, what equity looks like and how funders can sort of really get their heads around it, what would you like to see a funding body do?
I would love to see a foundation, just even in the beginnings of the conversation, right? It takes, at least one minimum of 1 year to build a relationship with a major foundation. And I've never seen that go faster unless you have some sort of inside connection. But I would love to see foundations actually get invested in understanding what the work entails and the human cost of the work, of social justice work. Because if a funder is really, truly invested in social movements, they will take the time to understand the human cost. Because once we understand the human cost, we cannot ignore the sweat equity and the labor that is involved. And especially, we cannot ignore if that sweat equity and labor is on the backs of people of color, right? So we need to actually take the time to not just say, okay, your annual reports are great, your quarterly reports are great, the great budget, fantastic, but what is the human cost here, and how can I as a funder support you in ensuring that we decrease this human cost, or support it by, for example, can you use part of the grant for mental health support, right? No grant ever that we've received has said, yes, use a little bit of it to support mental health for your employees, right? But that would be amazing, because this work is backbreaking.
I think, Uma, your talk at Losing Control is going to be a firecracker. And I feel sorry for everyone listening that isn't able to make it. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that feel your sentiments exactly. It's a double-edged knife or sword, as it were, because we're both frustrated at the funding situation and also frustrated with the kind of just generally trying to create progressive change in this context. So I thank you very much for the time that you've given us today. I know how busy you are fighting and smashing the patriarchy. It's we all really appreciate it. So thank you. And I'm looking forward to hearing you at Losing Control on the 4th of March.
Thank you so much, Esther, and I can't wait to be a part of the conversation and learn from everybody that's involved. Thank you for the invitation.
That was Uma Mishra-Newbery, Executive Director of Women's March Global. If our conversation has resonated, please come to the Losing Control in Funding and Commissioning event. The link can be found in the podcast description. If it's past the 4th of March, just get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. It is a topic we're constantly exploring and working on. I'm Esther, ESTHER, at thesocialchangeagency.org. And of course, we're on Twitter at socialchangeag. And finally, you can keep up to date with our monthly newsletter. Just sign up on our website, www.thesocialchangeagency.org. Thanks for listening.